I was setting the table when Mom's voice cut through the holiday chatter like a blade. It was Christmas Eve, 2023. The dining room smelled of roasted turkey and my grandmother's famous stuffing. My cousins were laughing in the living room, their kids running around with new toys. The house was warm, filled with the kind of love I had craved my entire adult life. I had driven 3 hours from my studio apartment to be here. I had bought gifts I couldn't afford. I had helped cook since dawn. I thought this year would be different. I thought maybe they finally saw me as family again. Before we dive in, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling me where in the world are you watching from. I was placing the last fork when she said it. "Sarah, we need to talk." Her tone was sharp, businesslike, the same tone she used when firing employees at her accounting firm. I looked up from the red cloth napkins I had been arranging. Mom stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her face set in that familiar mask of disappointment. Behind her, I could see Dad pretending to read his newspaper, but his shoulders were tense. He knew what was coming. "What's wrong?" I asked, though my stomach already knew. It was the same sick feeling I'd carried since I was 12, the knowledge that I was always one mistake away from being unwanted. "This can't continue," she said, walking into the room and closing the door behind her. "You're 28 years old. You show up here empty-handed, expecting us to take care of you like you're still a child." I stared at her, confused. "I brought gifts. I've been helping all day." "With what money?" she shot back. "The money you borrowed from your father last month? The money your uncle gave you for your car payment?" Each word hit like a slap. Yes, I had borrowed money. Yes, I was struggling. I was a freelance graphic designer trying to build a client base in a saturated market. Some months were good. Most weren't. But I had never asked for handouts. I had asked for help from family. "Mom, I'm working. I'm trying to build something." "You're 30 years old, Sarah." She wasn't listening. She never listened. "Your cousin Jennifer just bought her second house. Your brother Mark is making 6 figures. And you're still living in that tiny apartment, asking us to cover your phone bill." The comparison to my perfect cousins. The reminder that I was the family disappointment. The same script we'd been running since I graduated college. "Look around this room," she continued, gesturing at the beautiful dining table, the expensive china, the house that represented everything I couldn't achieve. "Everyone here has made something of themselves. Everyone except you." I felt something break inside me. Not my heart. That had been broken too many times. Something deeper. The last thread of hope that my family saw me as anything other than a burden. "What are you saying?" I asked, though I already knew. "I'm saying you need to leave. Tonight. Stop relying on this family to solve your problems. Figure out your own life." The words hung in the air between us. In the next room, I could hear my aunt laughing at something my uncle said. I could hear children playing. Normal family sounds. Sounds I was no longer welcome to be part of. "You want me to leave on Christmas Eve?" "I want you to grow up," she said coldly. "We've enabled this long enough. You come here, you eat our food, you take our money, and what do we get in return? Nothing but worry and embarrassment." There it was. The truth. I wasn't their daughter in that moment. I was their embarrassment. I stood there in my bargain sweater, holding a cloth napkin, feeling like I was 12 years old again. The same age when they first made it clear I wasn't measuring up to their standards. But I wasn't 12 anymore. I was a grown woman who had been stupid enough to believe that blood meant something. "Okay," I said quietly. The word surprised us both. She had expected me to cry, to beg, to promise to do better. Instead, I carefully folded the napkin I was holding and placed it on the table. "Okay," she repeated, uncertain now. "I'll pack my things." I walked past her, out of the dining room, through the living room where my relatives were still laughing and talking. None of them looked at me. They had heard. They had chosen their side. It took me exactly 12 minutes to pack everything I had brought. One small suitcase, a bag of gifts I would now return, and my purse. I moved efficiently, quietly, like I was checking out of a hotel. As I zipped my suitcase, I could hear Mom in the hallway, talking to Dad in hushed, urgent whispers. She was already having second thoughts, but it was too late. The door had been opened. The truth had been spoken. I carried my bag down the stairs. The house had gone quieter. The laughter was forced now, everyone pretending they couldn't hear the family drama playing out upstairs. I walked to the front door and stopped. For 28 years, I had been coming to this house for Christmas. 28 years of trying to earn my place at the table. I turned to see Mom standing at the top of the stairs. Her face was pale. "Sarah, Maybe we can talk about this after the holidays. I looked at her, this woman who had given birth to me but had never really seen me. There's nothing to talk about, I said. You made yourself clear. I need to stop relying on the family. I opened the door. The December air was bitter cold. Merry Christmas, Mom. I didn't slam the door. I didn't make a scene. I simply closed it behind me and walked to my car. The house glowed warm and golden in my rearview mirror as I drove away. It looked perfect from the outside, like a Christmas card, like the family I had always wanted to belong to but never would. The drive back to my apartment was the longest 3 hours of my life. But it wasn't because I was heartbroken. It was because I was finally, for the first time in my adult life, completely free. The apartment I returned to that night was small, cramped, and exactly what my mother had described. It was a studio in an older building with thin walls and a radiator that clanged all night. The furniture was secondhand. The kitchen was barely functional. But as I unlocked the door and stepped inside, I realized something profound. It was mine. Every stick of furniture, every book on the makeshift shelves, every photograph on the wall had been chosen by me, paid for by me, arranged by me. No one could take it away. No one could make me feel small in my own space. I set my suitcase down and looked around with new eyes. This wasn't a failure. This was freedom. I had been so focused on my family's definition of success that I had missed what I had actually built. I had created a business from nothing. I had clients who trusted me with their brands. I had work that challenged and fulfilled me. The money was inconsistent, but it was honest money earned from my own skills and creativity. I made myself a cup of coffee and sat at my small table, the same table where I worked late into the night on design projects. I pulled out my laptop and opened my client files. 23 active clients. Projects ranging from small business logos to website designs for startups. Work that mattered to the people who hired me. Real work. Creative work. Work that was building something. I looked at my bank account. It wasn't impressive by my family's standards, but it was mine. Every dollar had been earned through late nights and creative problem solving. There were no loans, no handouts, no strings attached. I was poor by some measures, but I was also completely independent. For the first time in years, I felt proud. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I stopped trying to fix my relationship with my family. Instead, I decided to build the family I wanted. I reached out to other freelancers in my building. We started having coffee together, sharing resources, collaborating on projects. I joined a co-working space downtown. I met entrepreneurs, artists, and dreamers who understood the uncertainty and freedom of building something from nothing. I found my tribe. Not people who shared my DNA, but people who shared my values, my struggles, my ambitions. We celebrated each other's wins and supported each other through failures. We became chosen family. My business grew, slowly at first, then rapidly. The clients I had been treating as temporary income became long-term relationships. I raised my rates. I moved to a better apartment. I bought health insurance. I started saving money. Real money, not just survival money. I learned about investing from YouTube videos and library books. I opened a retirement account. I bought a reliable car with cash. Every financial milestone felt like a victory, not because of the money itself, but because it proved I could take care of myself. I didn't need them. I never had. The hardest part wasn't the loneliness. It was unlearning the voice in my head that sounded exactly like my mother. The voice that said I wasn't good enough, wasn't successful enough, wasn't worthy of love or respect. That voice had been my constant companion for so long that silencing it felt like losing a part of myself. I started therapy, not because I was broken, but because I was ready to heal. My therapist helped me understand that my family's love had always been conditional. It was based on performance, on meeting their expectations, on being who they wanted me to be instead of who I was. You've been auditioning for a role in a play you never wanted to be in, she told me. What would happen if you stopped performing and started living? What happened was magic. Without the constant anxiety of disappointing my family, I became more creative, more confident, more myself. My work improved. My relationships deepened. I started dating again, but this time I chose partners who saw my independence as strength, not failure. I found someone who celebrated my unconventional path instead of trying to fix me. 2 years after that Christmas Eve, I was standing in my new office. Not a home office, a real office with my name on the door. I had hired my first employee, a recent college graduate who reminded me of myself at that age. Hungry, talented, and determined to prove herself. The business had grown beyond my wildest expectations. I wasn't just surviving. I was thriving. My phone rang. I glanced at the caller ID and felt that familiar knot in my stomach. It was Mom. I hadn't spoken to her since that night. There had been a few attempts at contact. A birthday card with a generic message. A text asking if I was still upset. But no apology. No acknowledgement of what had happened. No recognition that she had been wrong. I let it go to voicemail. When I played the message later, her voice was different. Smaller. Uncertain. "Hi Sarah, it's Mom. I heard about your business from your Aunt Linda. She saw the article in the newspaper. I just wanted to say, I wanted to talk to you. Could you call me back?" The article. The local business journal had done a feature on young entrepreneurs in the city. I was on the cover, standing in my office, smiling confidently. The headline read, "Building Dreams. How Local Designer Created Success on Her Own Terms." It was the kind of recognition my family valued. External validation. Public success. Proof that I had made something of myself, by their definition. But I had learned something important in those 2 years of silence. Their approval no longer mattered to me. I had found something better than their conditional love. I had found self-respect. I didn't call her back, not out of anger or spite, but because I had nothing to prove. I had already built the life I wanted. I had already become the person I was meant to be. The family that mattered to me now was the one I had chosen. My employees who trusted me with their careers. My clients who believed in my vision. My friends who celebrated my successes and supported me through challenges. The man I was falling in love with who saw my independence as beautiful, not broken. 6 months later, the invitation arrived in the mail. My cousin Jennifer's wedding. Inside was a handwritten note from my aunt. "We miss you, Sarah. The family isn't the same without you. Please come." I studied the invitation, the elegant script, the expensive paper. It was exactly the kind of event my family lived for. A chance to dress up, to show off, to perform happiness for each other and their friends. I RSVP'd no. Not because I was bitter, but because I was busy. I had a business to run, a life to live, a future to build. I was no longer available to play the role they had written for me. The day of Jennifer's wedding, I was at my office working on a rebranding project for a nonprofit that helped young women start their own businesses. It was meaningful work. Work that mattered. Work that paid well. As I reviewed logo concepts and marketing strategies, I thought about that Christmas Eve 2 years ago, the night my mother told me to stop relying on the family. She had meant it as a punishment, a way to force me back into line. Instead, she had given me the greatest gift of my life. She had given me permission to stop performing for an audience that would never appreciate the real me. She had pushed me out of a story that was never really mine and into the one I was meant to write. That evening, I closed my laptop and looked around my office. The walls were covered with framed projects, testimonials from happy clients, and photos of my team. On my desk was a thank you card from a client whose business had doubled after implementing my marketing strategy. This was success. Not the kind my family measured in house sizes and job titles, but real success. The kind that came from building something meaningful, from helping others, from being authentically yourself in a world that constantly pressures you to be someone else. I walked to the window and looked out at the city skyline. Somewhere out there, my family was dancing at a wedding, maintaining the same patterns they always had, comparing achievements, gossiping about who was successful and who wasn't, performing love for each other while keeping score of everyone's failures. I felt nothing but gratitude. Gratitude for the rejection that had forced me to find my own path. Gratitude for the criticism that had taught me to value my own opinion above all others. Gratitude for the conditional love that had shown me what unconditional acceptance felt like when I finally found it. My phone buzzed. A text from my business partner suggesting we grab dinner to celebrate landing a major client. This was family. People who chose to be in my life, who supported my dreams, who saw my worth without conditions. I grabbed my coat and headed for the door. I had a life to live, and for the first time ever, it was entirely my own. As I locked the office behind me, I thought about that scared woman who had packed her bag on Christmas Eve, convinced she was losing everything. She had no idea she was actually finding everything she had ever really wanted. The freedom to be herself. The power to build her own definition of success. The joy of chosen family. The peace that comes from knowing you are exactly where you belong. I had stopped relying on the family, just like Mom had demanded. And in doing so, I had discovered something far more valuable than their approval. I had discovered myself.